here, and usually they let me just restart. But for some reason, we didn't restart. So someone can just take the link and put it in the other chat. That would be great. So that everyone can just pile back in here. I hate this. I really, really hate this when the lives get interrupted. But here we are, folks. I'm just continuing. Hit the like button, please. Hit the subscribe button. Hit the notifications bell. Very, very, very annoying. Phone overheated. But here we are. I'm back, and still got your super chats written down, writing them down as they come in. So keep the super chats rolling in. And I'm about to wrap up my opening remarks, but I guess I'll keep making my opening remarks. I'll continue with what I was saying before, just right back into it. So, libertarians, the libertarian element, the libertarian element was where the far right could find its home, right? But they started to drift into the Trump camp. Starting kind of halfway through Obama's second term. The far right kind of drifted, the far right folks, the John Birch Society types, the folks that think that, there's an evil communist conspiracy against the sovereignty of the United States, the folks who think Hitler wasn't so bad, the folks who, are committed to the white race or whatever, those kind of folks started drifting out of the libertarian movement and into the Trump camp. And you had the rise of the so-called alt-right, Richard Spencer, people like that. That's where libertarianism as a political movement, now libertarianism is kind of weak. It's kind of deflated. Your typical libertarian is kind of a middle class, upper middle class college kid who wants to start their own business. Is very perky and wants to start their own business. They tend to have Republican parents, and they're too afraid to really challenge their conservative Republican parents' viewpoint, and so but they want to be free thinkers. They want to pretend they're somehow independent thinkers, and so they're libertarians, and they have LGBT friends and such, and their parents tend to be conservative and religious, and they want to assert their independence, but they're not brave enough. They would never dare read anything left-wing because that would just be too much against their parents. So they want to start a business and they want to be rich. And so that's your typical libertarian. And the kind of the oomph behind libertarians at one point was the far right. I mean, it was the John Birch Society, the white supremacists, the gun militia crowd. They were the strength behind libertarianism when it was a force to be reckoned with. But now those folks are in a different camp, and as a result, libertarianism is significantly weakened. And if you look at the United States, there's always been, for a long time in U.S. history, you've had a far right wing, I guess. You've had a far right wing in the United States. If you go back far enough, you've had a far right wing in the United States. There have been various attempts by factions in the U.S. ruling class to build Bonapartist kind of armies to get what they want. I mean, that's the whole point of this pamphlet, the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte by Karl Marx. He talks about how when there's a capitalist crisis, when the rate of profit is dropping, the capitalists start to fight among each other because they all want to stabilize society. They all want to stabilize society, but they want the other capitalists to be the ones to pay for it. And so they want one faction of the ruling class to take control of the state and use the state to stabilize the economy and resolve the capitalist crisis. That's generally what happens when there's a crisis of capitalism, is you get factions in the ruling class battling each other for power, utilizing the military and the policing agencies to do so, building kind of mass movements among the population to be their foot soldiers against other factions of the ruling class. That's what you get. And in France, you had the Society of December 10th and Louis Bonaparte. They built this army of what Karl Marx called the lumpen proletariat. Og for who's Og? Og, right? Okay, Og for president. You had the lumpen proletariat. This army of desperately poor people, intellectuals, criminals, etc. That was built by Louis Bonaparte in order to take power. And throughout U.S. history, you've had examples of that. The first Ku Klux Klan of the United States, that was after the Civil War. after the Civil War had taken place, there was kind of among the Southern plantation owners, they built kind of an army of desperately poor former Confederate soldiers and white people to kind of be their foot soldiers to stop black people from voting, to carry out armed attacks on the Union Army. And then the military was sent to the South to fight them, actually. And then you had Ulysses S. Grant. He sent the U.S. Army to fight the Klan. So that was the first incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan. But really, when the Ku Klux Klan of the United States became a mass organization, that was during the 1915, like in the lead up to World War I, and especially during the 1920s. The Democratic Party built kind of a mass right-wing movement called the Ku Klux Klan. And obviously it was very, very hostile to black people, and was arguing that the defeat of slavery had been so bad for the United States and that the U.S. government had betrayed the white man, blah, 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 blah. But one of their main targets was Roman Catholics. Roman Catholics were considered to be working for the Vatican. They were agents of a foreign power, and they were trying to take the sovereignty of the United States away. They were trying to come to the United States and breed and had lots of children so they could, make the United States part of the Vatican and take the sovereignty of the United States away. Okay, bodybuilder. And that was the feeling. That was what the Ku Klux Klan put out. They engaged in intimidation against Roman Catholics, intimidation against Jews, intimidation against various groups, violence, lynchings, terror. The Ku Klux Klan was this kind of mass anti-immigrant, anti-black, against women voting, against drinking alcohol. They favored prohibition and keeping alcohol illegal. It was this mass organization that existed in the 1920s that engaged in terrorism and violence, but also in a lot of just kind of mass right-wing campaigns that they engaged in for the purpose of attempting to support one faction of the U.S. ruling class that was around Woodrow Wilson. Then later, during the 1930s, the Ku Klux Klan was starting to decline, but you did have the factory owners. The factory owners who didn't like Roosevelt. There was a division in the ruling class, and the Rockefellers and Roosevelt, they were supporting the labor movement as a way to stabilize society. They thought granting union rights and would stabilize society to some degree or other. The Rockefellers, most of their money came from oil. It didn't come from factory production. So they weren't as opposed to labor unions as other capitalists might be. And on top of that, they wanted to align with the Soviet Union against the Nazis. You had a lot of factory owners, the National Association of Manufacturers. You had the Ford Motor Company and Henry Ford, and you had Henry Morgan, and there were a lot of industrial capitalists that favored fascism. And what's interesting is that was very different than the Ku Klux Klan. They tended to organize urban Catholics, urban Roman Catholics, against the Communist Party and the labor movement, which they considered to be Jewish. And you had Charles Coughlin, Father Coughlin, who was the radio priest, he was called. And he was a priest, a Roman Catholic priest in Michigan, who gave anti-Semitic radio broadcasts. And he would preach that the problems, that communism was a conspiracy by Jews, that the problem with capitalism was that people just didn't have good Christian values, but we needed to fight the main enemy, which was the Reds, the commies. That was Father Coughlin. You had the Black Legion of America, which was a group of, it was a lot like the Ku Klux Klan, except they wore black robes and they allowed Catholics to join. It was primarily a Catholic organization. And they actually murdered the father of Malcolm X. Malcolm X's father was a black minister who was sympathetic to Marcus Garvey and black nationalism. And it was the Black Legion that operated in Michigan. They killed Malcolm X's father, and that took place. You had the Silver Legion of America, which was a far right organization that was formed that followed the guy who started it was a novelist. He wrote like scary stories, like ghost stories. His name was William Dudley Pillay. And it was this ghost story novelist who believed he could talk to the dead and was into all this kind of weird witchcraft seance stuff. William Dudley Pillay, who was this, he wrote, pulp fiction, about witchcraft and people talking to the dead and stuff. He started his own organization called the Silver Legion of America, and they wore silver shirts, and they were fascists. I found an old article from Time magazine where they talked about how it seemed like in every different region there was somebody with some hood or some shirt, that was starting to, it was a black shirt or a silver shirt or a black hood or a yellow hood, brown shirts. There was the German American Bund that wore brown shirts, and there were various attempts to form some kind of fascist group. Generally among urban Roman Catholics in the 1930s to fight against the Communist Party and to fight against the labor movement. They all pretty much flopped. I mean, they tended to have a lot of money behind them. There would be factory owners that would support them, General Motors and the National Association of Manufacturers and Henry Ford would support these groups, but they never really could take off. Mainly because a lot of the most right-wing folks in the country were people that were Protestant in rural areas who just wanted to live in the countryside. They weren't interested in going to big rallies in the cities. And then on top of that, you had this big divide between Catholics and Protestants. You had big cultural issues that Catholics and Protestants couldn't agree on, like drinking alcohol. And on top of that, fascism was largely viewed as a foreign movement. It was viewed as something associated with Italy. It was associated with Nazi Germany. While the labor movement was fighting for the rights of workers on the job, the fascist current was seen as this foreign violent group. There's actually an interesting movie that was made in the 1930s that stars, who does it star? It stars a very famous actor. I can't remember the name of the actor. He was a very famous actor, and he made a movie called The Black Legion. It's called The Black Legion, and it's about a guy who works in a factory, loses his job, and he ends up joining one of these far right-wing organizations. He joins the Black Legion, and he discovers that it's a multi-level marketing scheme. That it's basically a scam to make money for the leaders of the group. Humphrey Bogart. Humphrey Bogart makes this movie about a guy who gets tricked into joining the Black Legion of America and eventually quits the group as he realizes that they're preaching anti-immigrant bigotry and they're just a scam to make money. That's a good movie you can watch, The Black Legion starring Humphrey Bogart. And that there was very much, there was attempts to build kind of a fascist current in the United States before the Second World War. Didn't really take off. The Ku Klux Klan in the 20s was a very big, effective, mass, Bonapartist organization for one section of the Democratic Party against others. But after the Second World War, it was after the Second World War, you had McCarthyism. And McCarthyism was this mobilization of all of society against communists. It was this feeling that communists were the enemy, the Cold War was starting, the Soviet Union had the atomic bomb and was going to nuke us all, and Sputnik was some kind of Soviet bomb trick or something, and we were all going to die at the hands of the Soviets, and communism was everywhere, and you had the House Un-American Activities Committee, you had the leadership of the Communist Party being put in prison, you had Hollywood writers losing their jobs and careers because they were associated with communism. And so, you had that situation. And then you'll recall that Joe McCarthy went too far with it. He accused the U.S. Army of being communist. He blackmailed a U.S. senator and got him to commit suicide. Basically, there was a U.S. senator whose son was gay, and Joe McCarthy blackmailed him, and to the point that this U.S. senator committed suicide, and that was revealed after he died. And Joe McCarthy was just kind of viewed as a threat not just to communists, but to the whole ruling class. He was seen as kind of, as trying to exercise power that was a threat. It was a threat to the entire ruling class. And because of that, let me just make sure that doesn't happen again. 1 second. All right. All right. All right. Oh, good Lord. Wow, I don't even use my home phone very much. There you go. My home phone was ringing, and I didn't want us to be interrupted, so I just got up and got rid of the home phone. Wow, this is me hanging out on a Thursday afternoon when I'm off work, folks. You're seeing the real me. This is me. But anyway, so you had Joe McCarthy, and he had gone after figures within the ruling class, and he had gone after the U.S. Army, and he had just, he had been kind of out of control. Sections of the ruling class were threatened by him. So Joe McCarthy, basically, the media turned against him. They had repeated his anti-communist campaigns, but they turned against him, and it was revealed that Joe McCarthy was gay. It was revealed that Joe McCarthy had blackmailed people and threatened people to advance his own career. Joe McCarthy was kind of starting to be hated. He eventually drank himself to death. Suicide by alcohol, basically. After that, though, there was a section of U.S. society that kept going with this, that kept going with McCarthyism. And it was small business owners, largely, and it was eventually what became the John Birch Society, the John Birch Society. And those were folks that were, they thought the U.S. government was communist, and they thought the Rockefellers were communists. They thought a lot of the biggest capitalists were communists. That was kind of their belief, that many of the richest and most powerful capitalists in the United States are secretly communists. That's what they believed. And that's pretty outrageous. That's a pretty outrageous belief, but that's what they believed. And in a lot of ways, the far right in the United States is largely an expression of the lower levels of capital. It is an expression of lower level capitalists who are not part of the club. And they resent the Anglo-American establishment. They resent the Rockefellers. Talk about, Rockefeller syndrome. They resent the rival, the elite, the entrenched power of the New England old money. They resent, the more high-level, wealthier capitalists, the ones that we can call the Eastern establishment. They resent them. They want a more libertarian economic model because they feel that then they might have a fairer chance of competing with the higher-level capitalists. They tend to be very anti-communist because they see labor unions as a direct threat to them, cutting into their profits. They tend to be more religious, and this is the far right. And it's been a long time aspect of the United States. We have a left in this country historically. We have the Communist Party, we have the Black Panthers, etc. There's a right in the United States, right? And the American right wing is very different than the European right wing. Because in the United States, we're not a nation state. We don't have, we don't have, a history going back to the Middle Ages. It's very different. The American far right, it tends to be very much a settler libertarian mindset. It tends to be very anti-communist. It tends to be pretty religious, fanatically religious. And, there's some, white supremacism tends to be a big part of it, but that's a specific current. Most of the American far right, I would argue, does not full-on publicly embrace, racial politics. I think they realize there's so much of a feeling in the United States that racism is, they might say racism isn't real. They might claim that affirmative action is discrimination against whites, blah, blah, blah. But the section of the American far right that goes full on and says we are racist, we are for white people, that's a very small element, right? Most of the American far right, the militia movement, the John Birch Society, people like that, they don't embrace racial politics full on. They tend to just argue that anti-racism is a big communist conspiracy, that racism isn't real, that racism is something made up by the government to justify affirmative action or the welfare state. This is who the far right is. You think about the Bundy Ranch, right? Cliven Bundy was this rancher who was out on his ranch, fighting the government or something. So is the American far right a threat? I mean, ideologically it is, right? Because again, we want people to turn against capitalism and to turn against imperialism and to turn against racism. We want people to have an anti-imperialist and anti-racist worldview. And we want especially people that are beginning to question the system. We want them to wake up and turn against the system. So it's a threat in that sense. Is the far right wing a threat in terms of taking power and establishing a fascist state? I would argue no. I mean, there are divisions in the ruling class. There are different factions battling for power. That's very clear. But I don't think we're facing the possibility of an ideologically far-right government emerging at any point in the United States anytime soon. In fact, I would argue that if anything, the Trump faction of the ruling class, which wasn't even fully in bed with the far right, right? Trump had one foot in the far right. He appealed to them, high-speed rail. All right, he appealed to the far right. But he wasn't fully in with the far right. I mean, the far right tend to be very anti-Israel. Trump loves Israel. The far right, they tend to be kind of, non-interventionist. Trump almost started World War III and murdered Qasem Soleimani. So, you have sections of the right, that are the far right that are toying with the Trump camp. But the Trump camp are not fully in with the far right. And on top of that, the Trump camp and the right in general are kind of on the defensive right now. They're on the defensive. Now, because they're on the defensive, they are filling the gap of dissidents. I've seen recently these anti-vax rallies. I've been in Union Square with the John Brown Volunteers doing outreach, and these anti-vaxxers, they are the dissidents, right? If you want to see protests in New York City right now, the biggest protests that you're seeing are by anti-vaxxers, and they are largely far right. They are largely people who consider the government to be communist. They're largely people who want real capitalism, and they promote these conspiracy theories about the vaccines, and they are largely coming from the right. Now, there are dissident elements of the left that kind of embrace them. There are some of the former, like Tompkins Square anarchists and folks like that embrace them. And then you have people like me, and you have people like Convo Couch. Well, I don't embrace that. I'm vaccinated. I don't think COVID is a hoax. I don't think the vaccine is going to kill you. But at the same time, I don't think anti-vaxxers are the enemy. I don't think they're the enemy. I just think they're wrong. And I think that the U.S. government has lied so many times, and that the U.S. government has done so much to kind of lose the trust of the American people, that many people are very suspicious of the establishment. Plus, many people have been devastated by the pandemic economically. And so on that basis, rather than, spewing hatred for people that are unvaccinated, people that refuse to get the vaccine, people that are believing in conspiracy theories about the vaccine, instead we ought to be challenging the establishment and trying to win these people to a better perspective. So I'm not embracing the anti-vax movement because a lot of things they say just are not accurate. I am, on the other hand, though, saying that the hostility being poured out at them by the left is problematic. But at the end of the day, I mean, is there a threat from the far right? Yeah, kind of, right? But ultimately, the only thing that can deal with that threat is real Marxist communism. And that's not aligning with the Democrats, not canceling these people and calling them fascists and Nazis, not just doing everything we can to secure the Democrats. No. The way to liquidate the far right is to give them a real perspective, to give them a real anti-imperialist perspective, to refute their arguments, and to get people who are against the system and questioning the government to go in a left-wing direction rather than a right-wing one. Really, the only way that we can deal with the far right now is to build our own movement, to build our own political current, and to do so in an ideological way, and to do so in a way that people can be won to. I mean, socialist patriotism, explaining our ideas. We need to develop a left wing that is ideologically coherent, that can explain our politics in a clear way. That's what we need to do. That's the only way we can really kind of deal with the far right. So I talked about a lot of things so far in this stream. We got interrupted, but I kept going. I talked about liberalism and illiberalism. We talked about libertarianism and all of that. And ultimately, if we want to defeat the alt-right, we need socialist education. Out of the movement to the masses. We need to preach our own ideas. We need to espouse Marxism, Leninism, and anti-imperialist ideas. That's the only way to really deal with it. And the hysteria surrounding the far right, they're all going to take over and we're all going to die. No, that's not what's going to happen. January 6th was pretty awful, and that kind of demonstrated how big the crisis is, but there's no danger of the ideological far right becoming the government anytime soon. There is a danger of all kinds of things if we don't build an actual class-conscious class struggle movement. If we don't get out of the movement and get to the masses, if we don't start winning over average people to our perspective, things are only going to get worse. We need to spread a socialist message. Only we can offer this. Only we can offer this, and that's what I am on here talking about. So I've gotten a few super chats already. Keep the super chats rolling in. Names and locations, folks. Names and locations. I will call you out as I see you. Who's with us today? Names and locations. Names and locations. Kendall in San Diego, welcome. POC and indigenous people fundamentally opposed to patriotic socialism. All right, POC, indigenous, opposed. All right. All right. So Scotland, West Virginia, Serbia, Happy Valley, Oregon, Vancouver, Washington, West Virginia, San Antonio, Texas, Ash in Chicago, Stephen in Riverside, California, Etatist in Leipzig, East Germany, Ramsey out in Cincinnati, Ohio, Jenny Lynn in Cincinnati, Ohio. Welcome, Jenny. Zephyr from Eugene, Oregon, Denver, Dust James in Virginia, Morgan in Philadelphia, Mo in Toronto, Canada, Tristan in Maryland. Shout out to you, Tristan, good friend of the show. Jeff in Studio City, Montreal, Ben in Suffolk County, what's good? Tim Stacy in Kentucky, Utah, Arturo in Anchorage, Alaska, Joshua from Brooklyn, Santa Rosa, California, Grand Junction, Colorado, Richard in Tacoma, Vinicius in Brazil, Illinois, London, Michigan, Quinn and Meredith in Eatonville, West Virginia, or Washington, Yugoslavia, Pomona, California, Santiago, Chile, Idaho, Illinois, Sacramento, Sam in Chicago, Peter from Poland, Bonnie Bridge, Scotland, Germany, Roy in Soledad, California, Natalie in Maryland, shout out to you, good friend of the program, Ron, languishing in St. George, Utah. Hi, I'm from the UK and I love your streams. Very good. Vallejo, California, Portugal, Lisbon, Ben in Chicago, Micah in Las Vegas, Toronto, Claudio in Portugal. Did I miss roll call? No, you didn't, William. Madonna in Iran. Shout out to you, Madonna. Los Angeles County. Charles from Waterloo, Canada. Sir Craigie in Fort Lauderdale. St. Louis. Captain Waffles in Florida. Jorge, Virginia. Or George, Virginia, Sam in Australia, Mr. Lizard, Berlin, Germany is with us. Who else is with us today? Names and locations. I'll call you out as I see you. Names and locations. Kolkata, India, nomadic tribe. All right. Very good. Who else is with us today? Anybody else? Names and locations. Names and locations. Who's with us? Jason from Rome, Georgia. Welcome, Jason. Be sure to hit the like button. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. Be sure to hit the notifications bell. Jeff in Jacksonville, New Jersey. Naples, Florida. Harold Sullivan is with us. Shout out to you, right? There you go. Anybody else? Names and locations. And so now I'm going to spend the rest of this stream, San Francisco, California, Lisbon, Portugal, Dennis Carver in the Midwest, Missouri. So I'm going to spend the rest of this stream, answering super chat questions. So I've got a number of them written down here. And thank you, Third Rail. I've got a number of them written down here. So if you have something else you want me to talk about, send me a super chat and I will answer your question. All right, so internationalism versus patriotism, the Marxist synthesis. Well, that came up a lot in the recent stream with Jackson Hinkle. And the feeling is that to truly love your country, you must be an anti-imperialist. And to truly oppose imperialism, you must love your country. Decentralization, which was only previously possible with centralized structure. All right. Decentralization. Only possible with a central structure. And I make that argument, right? That to truly love the United States means you want to dismantle imperialism. It means you want to move toward a socialist economy. It means you want to grant autonomy to the various colonized people and self-determination. It means that you are opposed to racism. It means you want the whole country to be reborn and have friendship and win-win cooperation with the people of the world. That's what truly loving the United States means. So to truly love the United States, you need to be an anti-imperialist and a socialist and an internationalist. And to truly be an internationalist, you can't want the whole world to be anti-imperialist, but the United States not be. You can't want the United States to not be included in this. So to truly be an internationalist, you must love the United States. So patriotism and internationalism are not contradictory. Yeah, I mean, there's a desperation with this patriotism debate. There's a desperation, once you say that you advocate patriotic socialism, you want to make a better country, people immediately jump in and say, that means you're supporting racism. No, it doesn't. That means you don't recognize this country was founded on slavery. No, it doesn't. That means that you want to support American wars abroad. No, it doesn't, right? And that they just jump in, that means all these things it doesn't mean. Upcoming Canadian elections, Marxism and socialism, right? Difference. Marxism and socialism. Canadian elections, right? And they just jump in with all of this. Well, that means you don't support, self-determination for indigenous groups. You don't support decolonization. I mean, again, none of that is what we're saying. So patriotism just means that you want a better life for the country in which you live. That's all that it means. You want life to get better. You wish well to the country in which you live on. That's all that it means. And the fact that there's such a hostile reaction to it, it shows that there is a real commitment to the hostility, to remaining isolated from the masses of people, to being angry, to being a fringe element. I often think about, and this comes up many times, this comes up around the concept of growth and how socialism is about having vast material abundance and eradicating scarcity. This comes up around the patriotism debate. I argue that socialists have adopted an incel mindset, right? That the incel decides he can never get a girlfriend, and he develops a whole ideology and a whole worldview centered around not being able to get a girlfriend, right? And it's like, well, women are all evil, and there's a conspiracy against men. And it's like the guy has decided he can never get a girlfriend. So his whole worldview starts to be wrapped around the idea he can never get a girlfriend. Women are oppressing him. And it's like communists in the United States, a lot of them, a lot of the online communists have developed a whole worldview centered around the belief that we could never possibly take power. Masses of Americans will never become socialists, that therefore Americans are labor aristocrats, therefore, this is about driving the living standards. Their whole worldview is so tainted by this assumption that they could never take power. And revolutions don't happen very often. They're very rare events, but things do happen, right? The world does change, and this belief that we could never win. And then the other thing is that how do you piss off an incel? If you really want to piss off an incel, how do you piss them off? What do you say to them? You say, oh, why don't you just work out more? Why don't you learn some pickup lines? And why don't you? That really pisses them off, because they are so defeated and they are so angry and demoralized by their belief that women could never be attracted to them, that if you start to say there is a possibility, they just come forth with this rage. How dare you tell me that? No, there is no possibility. They seethe with rage, right? They would much rather have you call them sexist. They would much rather have you call them misogynists than to ever say to them they could possibly get a girlfriend, because how dare you suggest it? Because that's an attack on their whole worldview. You're saying their worldview, their premise, which is they could never possibly get a girlfriend, their premise is wrong. Well, I would argue that communists need to stop thinking like incels, because I think we could have socialism in the United States. But also the rage that has been directed at me and Jackson Hinkle and Haas and others for invoking socialist patriotism is that incel rage. We're saying we could actually win, and that pisses people off. That's infuriating to these people, right? And I think about, there was somebody I knew years ago who was one of the nicest people, a very nice, loving person, but he had a drinking problem. He had a drinking and a drug problem. And the only way to get this guy mad was to suggest that he had a drinking and a drug problem, right? He would never get mad. He was the most polite person. But if you said that he maybe was drinking a little bit too much, the anger came out. How dare you? How dare you? Because that's how important drinking all the time and using drugs was to him. Right? If you want to see a drug addict get mad, suggest they might be a drug addict. If you want to see an incel get mad, suggest they might be able to get a girlfriend. This is when people develop kind of a pathological mindset, and part of them realizes that it's pathological, that it's problematic, right? Pathological just means like an illness or a sickness. It's not correct, right? Whether it's drug addiction, whether it's inceldom, they become very, very defensive and filled with rage in support of it. I'm forced to think about the first working class. No, it wasn't the first, but there was a socialist peasant movement in Britain. In 1649, it was called the Diggers. I don't know if people have ever heard of it. The Diggers. It was a peasant utopian kind of agrarian socialist movement in Britain, right? And it was at St. George's Hill. They seized a hill and they started kind of building a socialist commune there, and they were eventually executed. It was during the English Civil War. But they had the anthem. They were called the True Levelers or the Diggers. They had an anthem. And the anthem has many verses to it. You noble diggers all, stand up now, ye noble diggers all, stand up now. The wasteland to maintain, we cavaliers by name, our digging does maintain, and earth and all to blame, stand up now. Well, anyway, one of the verses of the Diggers' anthem, proletarian side of the American Revolution, one of the verses of the Diggers' anthem, one of the verses of the Diggers' anthem, I'm trying to remember the first part of it. One of the verses of it has always spoken to me because I see this, right? And the line is, such fury they demise, the devil in them lies and hath blinded both their eyes, stand up now. Right, and it's referring to the fact that it's referring to the fact that in the face of their uprising, there were some forces that kind of knew that they were right to demand collective ownership of land, to demand the end of the exploitation of the peasantry, but because they kind of knew the Diggers were right, they fought against them even more viciously. Right, some of the most vicious oppressors of the Diggers were Oliver Cromwell, were the Levelers, who believed in expanding sovereignty and the right to vote, and that they saw what the Diggers were doing in fighting for total social equality, fighting for basically a vision of communism, of a classless world, and it was a big threat to them because deep down they sympathized with it, right? And such fury they devise, the devil in them lies and hath blinded both their eyes, stand up now, right? And that often, what that was really about, is that, and this is true in many aspects of life. This is true in many, many aspects of life, which is that when people kind of agree with you, that's when they find your arguments the most threatening, right? If people don't sympathize with you to some degree or other, they're not really gonna be threatened by your arguments. When people respond to your argument with rage, it means there's a part of them that probably agrees with you. And the bigger the rage means, the more threatened they are by the part of themselves that agrees with you. All nihilism is BS. Even if it's all lost, there's no hope. That just means nothing to gain for. Fighting is impossible because everything is impossible until it's done. Very good point. I'm writing that down. Nihilism is BS. Everything impossible. And, the rage that flows out of the third worldists, the rage that flows out of the anti-patriotic current, that's what this is, right? We are suggesting that we could actually win. And that is what infuriates them. It's what absolutely infuriates them. It infuriates them to hear this. They just fill with rage. How dare they? How dare they? How dare they suggest that we could win? And that's what it is. That's really what it is when it gets down to it. So I just wanted to share that with folks. And that's probably, in my view, that's probably what a lot of the rage is about. So there you go. But anyway, that's my thought. So the next question is, should we support Trump in starting a nuclear war with China? No. Nuclear war bad. I bet even Og the Destroyer would know that. Og the Destroyer might hate Russia. Og hate Russia. Og hate China. Og hate nuclear war. Og the Destroyer would probably, even as bad as Og the Destroyer is, Og the Destroyer, if you don't get the joke, go watch the beginning of the stream. Og the Destroyer would probably oppose nuclear war. So yeah, nuclear war, not good at all. But the fact that, there was this situation where there were generals talking to China without Trump's permission indicates what I've said many times, which is that the civilian government doesn't have total power, that there are factions in the ruling class, etc., that have the power. The next question I've got is an analysis of Star Wars. All right, well, that's an interesting one. I did, I've watched all the Star Wars movies. I've watched the Star Wars movies. There are various new left themes in Star Wars, I would say. There are not Marxist themes, I guess. I mean, maybe. There's definitely an influence on Star Wars by Marxism, but it's overall not a Marxist story. It's a space opera, right? And a lot of people say that they don't even consider Star Wars to be a work of science fiction. They consider Star Wars to be a fantasy work about knights and castles and swords and empire and magic. It just happens to take place in space, right? The heroes are the Jedi Knights, who have these swords, they're lightsabers. They have this power called the Force, where they do mystical stuff, and the bad guys, the dark side, they're the Empire, they're the dark side of the Force. It's like black magic versus white magic. It's a lot of fantasy themes just put into an outer space setting. Star Wars, you could very easily see Star Wars taking place in the Middle Ages in Europe, and witches and knights and castles and swords and all of that, but they just happened to place it in space. And that's what makes Star Wars a weird synthesis. Many people have talked about how fantasy is very much associated with the right wing, and science fiction is associated with the left wing. The Soviet Union loved science fiction. Nazi Germany loved fantasy. A lot of people don't realize this, but the Nazis were all about fantasy. Wagner and the Wagnerian operas were like the official state propaganda in Nazi Germany. The Nazis, they used the story of Sleeping Beauty as the analogy that they taught children about why Hitler had to come to power. The Nazis, they called themselves the Third Reich. They were constantly trying to restore the Middle Ages. Even the anti-Semitism of the Nazis was very much inspired by the Middle Ages. It was an attempt to go back to the pogroms of the various kings of the Middle Ages, and kind of a medieval mystical contempt for Jews as being in opposition to good society, etc. So the Nazis were very much into fantasy, whereas science fiction was the Soviet Union. The Soviet sci-fi movies were widely loved, and I believe George Clooney remade. There was a Soviet sci-fi movie that was remade. It was remade by George Clooney because it was so widely loved. Solaris is the name of it, and there was a lot of Soviet sci-fi. And in fact, I believe What Is to Be Done, which was Vladimir Lenin's most important book, he took the title from a popular science fiction novel. There was a science fiction novel in Russia called What Is to Be Done. And so, the very name of Lenin's most famous book, What Is to Be Done, was like kind of taken from a sci-fi novel. Science fiction is more progressive, so that's what makes Star Wars weird, because it's a mixture of the two. It is very much a mystical fantasy story mixed in at the same time with science fiction imagery, right? And it's weird, and people joke about why does every planet have one climate, for example, in Star Wars, right? They have an ice planet, they have a desert planet, they have a swamp planet. That doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, right? The Earth, it has swamps in it, it has deserts in it, it has ice and snow and polar caps in it. So wouldn't planets that are inhabitable have all of those things? That's kind of a thing they like to joke about, right? Is that Star Wars, you have the desert planet, Tatooine, right? And then you have the ice planet. I don't even remember what the ice planet's called. And you have the forest planet where the Ewoks are. And, that's people like to make fun of that. and that, okay, so there are new left themes in Star Wars. Original Star Wars was a Vietnam War allegory. Well, yes and no. Okay, George Lucas has admitted that he was kind of inspired. The rebels in Star Wars are kind of inspired by the Vietnamese National Liberation Front. And, that's true, but I don't think it was meant full on as a Vietnam War allegory. I think that was just a source of inspiration. That it was the late 70s, the USA had been defeated in Vietnam. It was the Carter years, the Carter administration, and there was starting to be kind of in the aesthetics at the time, there was kind of an admiration for third world revolutionaries. That's when, the USA started the Afghan War and was trying to present the Mujahideen and Osama bin Laden as third world revolutionaries. And, that there was kind of this kind of aesthetic coming out of the 1960s. There was this aesthetic admiration for peasant liberation fighters, that kind of came from the U.S. defeat in Vietnam. That was part of the culture, the counterculture at the time was admiring people that were fighting the empire and stuff. So that was, it was inspired by that. That was very much an idea that was in the atmosphere at the time. I wouldn't say they were directly inspired by the Vietnamese. I think it was just because the Vietnamese had inspired the whole world. And there are a lot of movies, a lot of books where the heroes were some kind of peasant liberation army. Che Guevara t-shirts started to be popular. By the early 80s, you started to see Che Guevara t-shirts everywhere. And that was very much just a concept that was in art and movies at the time, was this, the third world romantic revolutionary. So he utilized what was a common trope at the time. The other thing is that, so the first Star Wars movie, and originally, many people thought that there would only, George Lucas didn't assume that the original Star Wars, A New Hope Star Wars, would be the first movie. He thought it would be the only one. He didn't know it was going to be such a big box office hit. So that first Star Wars, right, was meant to be a standalone piece. And then it got to be so good, you had the trilogy, etc. It was meant to be a standalone piece, and there's new left themes in Star Wars, right? So, Luke Skywalker is a rebellious teenager whose family doesn't really understand him. He lives with his uncle Owen, and he lives on this desert, and he's bored. And, his family doesn't really understand him, but there's this mystical guy, Ben Kenobi, who lives around the area or something, and, everyone says he's a crazy old man, and somehow Luke Skywalker ends up leaving the family that doesn't understand him and going off to join the revolution. That's very 1960s. That's Haight-Ashbury, teenage runaways, that is the 1960s if you ever heard of it, right? That was go live on a commune, skip town and go and do sex and drugs. And that was a big part of, the 1960s culture. The counterculture of the 1960s was they talked about middle-class young people who felt like they didn't fit in, kind of running away and going to be hippies, going to be urban revolutionaries, going to protest using drugs. That is a very 1960s aesthetic. It's not a particularly Marxist aesthetic, I would argue. It was considered left-wing at the time, and it was, again, very much in the culture. But again, I wouldn't call it Marxist per se. It was a theme in the culture. The other thing is the Jedi Knights in Star Wars. It's Eastern mysticism, right? It's supposed to sound like the Hare Krishna movement. It's supposed to sound like Buddhism. It's this mystical religion that is very hard to understand, that teaches you to use psychic powers. Again, that's the 1960s and the new left, the synthetic left, and their admiration for Eastern mysticism, right? It's like an Eastern thing, man. And you're going to get psychic powers, dude. You're going to see visions. You're going to be able to lift books with your brain, man. That is a totally a new left 1960s thing, if such a thing ever existed. That is very new left. And even the dark side of the Force thing, right? It's like hate leads to fear, and fear leads to suffering. And it's all like the power of love will overcome the power of hate, brother. You almost wonder if George Lucas, was having an acid trip when he thought of the whole thing. It's very much a lot of new left themes, and a fantasy story thrown into outer space settings. It's a very, it's very clever. I mean, you have to say it. And there's a reason that these movies are still popular. There's a reason that they're still making them, right? They sold the rights to Disney. There's a reason. I mean, it's a brilliant kind of formula politically. I mean, the fact that you can have all of those things. So you have some of the themes that were in the culture widely, Eastern mysticism, support for a rebel army against an empire, resistance. On top of that, you can throw in fantasy and science fiction. It's a very clever mixture of a lot of themes. One thing that I remember is, before the pandemic, I used to like to go to the Met. I would go to the Met. Like once a year, my wife and I would go to the opera. And I remember watching the beginning of Wagner's Ring Cycle. They have like the beginning where like the Fates are like sewing the lines of fate, and they're kind of like giving the introduction to the story. And while I was watching that in the Wagner opera, in Gotterdammerung, it starts out, they're weaving the fate, right? The people who are like writing the world, these forces are like, weaving, and they tell you what's going on. I remember seeing that. And thinking, this is just like the opening of the Star Wars movie. It's like the text on the screen at the beginning of the Star Wars movie. At the beginning of Wagner's Ring Cycle operas, you have the opening scene where the fates are like weaving together, and it's like that's what it is, and the tone of the music and everything. It's like this is the beginning of, it's like we're about to see episode 4 of the Ring Cycle. I mean, and there's a lot of Wagnerian themes. You can argue, that the music of Star Wars is very Wagnerian, right? The way Darth Vader has his theme song, bum, 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 and the way different characters have their theme song, that's very Wagnerian, right? In the Wagner opera, the giants have their song, and Siegfried has his thing, and that it's like there's little bits of music that go with every character, right? That's very, very Wagnerian. So, Star Wars is interesting. Now, George Lucas, he did admit that he was inspired by the Vietnamese, for the rebels. That's true. And he also made statements praising the Soviet Union. He pointed out that there was more creative freedom for filmmakers in the Soviet Union than there was in the United States, because in the Soviet Union, as long as you didn't challenge the government censors, you could say what you wanted, whereas in the United States, the marketing companies are so desperate to control what you do to make the most amount of money that that the advertisers and the studios and the big corporations, they do a lot more censorship. And that was one thing that was pointed out. So that's kind of interesting. That's my long analysis of Star Wars. Next, Og for president. Well, in the opening bit, I joked about Og the Destroyer. I invented this character called Og the Destroyer, who's highly illiberal, but supported by the liberals against Russia and China. A shirtless man with a sword named Og the Destroyer, who's wildly homophobic and wildly anti-Semitic and wildly racist, but the U.S. government supports him against Russia and China, and I had some fun with that, so maybe we'll come back to Og the Destroyer. Maybe that can be a running joke that we do, but there you go. Someone said about this bodybuilder, I don't follow bodybuilding. I really don't. I appreciate that you think I'm fit enough that I might do that, but I don't follow bodybuilding. I don't really follow it. So there you go. Someone commented that we need high-speed railway. I agree. We absolutely need high-speed railway in the United States. The highways and bridges are crumbling. It would be a much more efficient way of transporting things across the country, high-speed railway. I 100% agree we need high-speed railway. Now, the next thing that was on here was it says, what about people of color and indigenous people that are opposed to patriotic socialism? I agree. I 100% agree. And I have said, okay, and I've always said that I would support the right of any person of color, a black person, a Chicano, to say they don't consider themselves an American, to call for a separate national territory, to burn the American flag. I support their right to do that, okay? And that is a question of self-determination for a colonized people, right? The black people of the United States constitute an oppressed nation within